In the endless void between stars, where light itself grows weary and dies, there exists a chapter of galactic history so drenched in blood that even time itself tried to forget it. 1,000 years of screaming darkness, a millennium where the very fabric of the Force was torn apart by hate, ambition, and an unquenchable thirst for power. Picture armies of Sith Lords, not two hiding in shadows, but hundreds commanding legions that blotted out the sun. Imagine Jedi Knights, not peacekeepers in elegant temples, but blood-soaked warriors fighting for survival in trenches filled with the dead. Envision entire star systems turned to ash in a single afternoon, their populations of billions reduced to cosmic dust and fading screams. This is not the Empire you know. This is not Vader's cold, calculated cruelty. This is something far worse. This is the new Sith Wars, and what happened in a cursed valley on a forgotten world called Ruusan will haunt you long after this tale is told. They say that on Ruusan, in the final moments before annihilation, a Sith Lord named Kayan stood in a cave surrounded by 14 of the most powerful dark side users in existence. Together, they were about to unleash something so terrible, so fundamentally wrong, that even they didn't fully understand what they were creating. And on the surface above, 40 Jedi Knights stood in a circle, knowing they were about to die, but refusing to run. What happened next would end 1,000 years of war in a single soul-shattering instant. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how the galaxy descended into this nightmare, we need to go back to where it all began. Tonight we dive into the most brutal era in Star Wars history that almost nobody talks about. An age of darkness that lasted longer than any empire, claimed more lives than any plague, and reshaped the galaxy in ways that echo even to the time of Luke Skywalker. We're talking about the new Sith Wars, a millennium-long conflict, so savage that both the Republic and the Jedi Order tried to erase it from memory. Now here's the thing, 71% of you watching right now aren't subscribed. If you're enjoying these deep dives into the darkest corners of Star Wars lore, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel grow and lets me know you want more stories like this. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing this community span across different time zones and continents, all united by our love for these epic tales. So settle in, get comfortable, maybe dim those lights. This is going to be a long journey through one of the most horrifying periods the galaxy has ever known. Let's begin. 2,000 years before Luke Skywalker would ignite his lightsaber on Tatooine, the Galactic Republic stood at what many believed was the pinnacle of civilization. For over 3,000 years, peace had been the galaxy's constant companion. Oh, there were pirates to deal with, the occasional border dispute, criminal syndicates that needed dismantling. But true war, galactic-scale conflict, that was ancient history, the stuff of legends told to frighten younglings. The Republic Senate on Coruscant had grown fat and comfortable. Senators debated trade regulations and taxation policies with the passion that warriors once reserved for battle. The very concept of a standing military had become almost quaint. Why would you need vast armies when the Jedi Order, 10,000 strong, could resolve conflicts with diplomacy and the occasional wave of a hand? And the Jedi, gods, the Jedi of this era were magnificent in their confidence. They walked the galaxy as living embodiments of peace, their lightsabers more ceremonial than practical. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant was a place of meditation, philosophical debate, and serene contemplation. Most Jedi Knights went their entire lives without ever drawing their weapons in anger. Combat training was maintained more as tradition than necessity. After all, the Sith had been extinct for 3 millennia, defeated in the Great Hyperspace War and scattered to the cosmic winds. Or so everyone believed. But in the unknown regions, beyond the mapped hyperspace lanes, beyond the reach of Republic scouts and Jedi seekers, Something ancient and malevolent had been growing in the darkness. The Sith had not died. They had merely waited for 3,000 years. They nursed their hatred, rebuilt their strength, and studied every weakness in the Republic's gleaming facade. These were not the Sith of Darth Bane's later philosophy. These Sith believed in armies, in vast empires, in crushing their enemies through overwhelming force. Dozens of Sith Lords had risen to power in their hidden worlds, each commanding thousands of dark side warriors, each building fleets that could darken the skies of entire systems. And they had learned patience. They watched as the Republic grew complacent, as the Jedi became philosophers rather than warriors, as the galaxy's military might atrophied into ceremonial defense forces. They studied the hyperspace routes, identified the most vulnerable systems, pinpointed exactly where the Republic's authority was weakest. The Outer Rim territories were especially ripe for conquest. These frontier worlds received little support from Coruscant, suffered under corrupt local governments, and harbored growing resentment toward the core worlds that seemed to have forgotten they existed. Criminal cartels had more influence than Republic law in many sectors. Dark side cults operated openly on isolated planets, and nobody from the core seemed to care enough to stop them. It was a powder keg soaked in fuel, and the Sith were about to strike the match. In the year 2000, before the Battle of Yavin, as the Republic celebrated another year of prosperity and peace, Sith fleets were entering hyperspace, their coordinates locked on unsuspecting worlds. The longest, bloodiest war in galactic history was about to begin, and nobody saw it coming. The attack came without warning, without declaration, without mercy. On a humid summer morning in the Outer Rim system of Krant, farmers were tending their fields when the sky suddenly turned black, not with storm clouds but with warships. Hundreds of them, bearing markings that no living being recognized. The insignia of the ancient Sith Empire, thought extinct for 3,000 years, now blazed across hulls bristling with weapons. The orbital bombardment lasted 17 minutes. That's all it took to reduce a thriving agricultural world of 2 million souls into a burning graveyard. The Sith didn't bother landing troops. They didn't demand surrender. They simply opened fire and moved on to the next target. Within 72 hours, 12 Republic systems went dark. Communications ceased. Supply ships that entered those sectors never returned. When Republic scouts finally worked up the courage to investigate, they found worlds transformed into nightmares, cities reduced to rubble, populations either dead or enslaved. And everywhere that ancient symbol of the Sith painted on walls, carved into ruins, burned into the very ground itself. Leading this initial wave of devastation was a being who had once walked the halls of the Jedi Temple as a respected master. His birth name had been forgotten, abandoned along with everything he once believed. Now he bore a title that would echo through history with dread: Darth Ruin. Ruin's fall to the dark side had occurred 50 years earlier, but he'd kept it hidden, carefully concealed behind a mask of Jedi serenity. He studied forbidden holocrons in secret, made contact with Sith remnants in the unknown regions, and slowly built a network of fallen Jedi who shared his contempt for the Order's passive philosophy. When he finally revealed himself and fled to Sith space, he took with him not just ancient knowledge, but 17 other Jedi who followed him into darkness. But Ruin was no simple fallen Jedi consumed by personal ambition. He was a visionary in the most terrible sense of that word. Where other Sith Lords bickered and schemed against each other, Ruin saw the fatal flaw that had doomed every previous Sith Empire: division in fighting. The self-destructive nature of the dark side itself. His solution was radical. He proposed something that went against every traditional Sith teaching: unity, not under a single all-powerful emperor, but as a brotherhood of dark lords working toward a common goal: the complete and utter destruction of the Jedi Order and the Republic they served. It took Ruin 30 years to bring the scattered Sith factions together. 30 years of political maneuvering, strategic assassinations, and carefully orchestrated alliances. By the time his fleets emerged from the unknown regions, he commanded not just his own forces, but the combined might of 40 Sith Lords, each bringing their own armies, their own warships, their own dark side warriors. The new Sith Empire, as Ruin named it, represented a concentration of dark side power not seen since the days of the ancient Sith, and unlike their predecessors, they had learned from history. They knew the Republic's weaknesses. They understood Jedi combat doctrine. They had spent generations preparing for this moment. The Republic's response was catastrophically slow. When the first reports of attacks reached Coruscant, many senators refused to believe them. The Sith were extinct. This had to be some elaborate piracy operation, perhaps a new criminal cartel using old symbols to inspire fear. Even when holographic evidence of the attacks was presented, showing fleets bearing Sith insignias and dark-robed warriors wielding red lightsabers, the Senate spent 3 weeks debating whether this constituted an actual emergency. The Jedi Council recognized the threat immediately, but found themselves paralyzed by their own inexperience. None of the current council members had ever commanded forces in a real war. Their combat experience consisted of stopping slave traders and defusing hostage situations, not coordinating military operations across multiple star systems. They were peacekeepers being asked to become generals, and the transition was neither smooth nor swift. The first Jedi response team was dispatched to the mining world of Korbos in the Outer Rim. 200 Jedi Knights, led by Master Murtagh, believed they could liberate the planet through a combination of tactical strikes and inspiring the local population to rise up against their Sith occupiers. It was the kind of operation the Jedi had successfully executed dozens of times against pirates and warlords. But the Sith were neither pirates nor warlords. Murtagh's force landed in what they thought was a lightly defended sector. Within minutes they realized they'd walked into a trap. The Sith had allowed them to land, had wanted them to land, because waiting in the caves and canyons of Korbos were not hundreds but thousands of dark side warriors, Sith apprentices, dark Jedi, fallen warriors from a dozen species, all trained in lightsaber combat, all hungry for the chance to kill a Jedi. The Battle of Korbos lasted 3 days and 2 nights. The Jedi fought with everything they had, their lightsabers blazing in the darkness, their force powers pushed to the absolute limit, but they were outnumbered 10 to 1, and these weren't the untrained rabble they'd dealt with in the past. These were warriors who had spent years, sometimes decades, training specifically to kill Jedi. Master Murtagh fell on the first day, overwhelmed by 5 Sith apprentices working in perfect coordination. His death sent shockwaves through the Jedi Force. They'd never lost a council-level master in combat, not in living memory. By the second day, the Jedi had lost half their number. The survivors formed a defensive circle in a narrow canyon, their backs literally against a cliff face. They held that position for 28 hours, repelling wave after wave of attackers. Their lightsabers became extensions of pure survival instinct. There was no elegance here, no philosophical discussion of the Force, just desperate warriors fighting for their lives. On the third day, a Republic frigate managed to break through the Sith blockade. The 30 Jedi who survived the battle were evacuated, many of them physically and psychologically broken. They had learned a terrible lesson. The Sith weren't just back. They were stronger, more organized, and far more dangerous than anything the Jedi Order was prepared to face. Word of the Korbos massacre spread through the Order like poison. Jedi who had never felt fear in their lives suddenly understood what it meant to face extinction. The comfortable certainty that had defined their existence for generations evaporated overnight. They were no longer the unquestioned guardians of peace and justice. They were prey. Darth Ruin didn't celebrate the victory. He understood that Korbos was just the opening move in a game that would span centuries. His strategy wasn't to conquer quickly, but to break the Republic's spirit slowly, make them understand that nowhere was safe, that the Jedi couldn't protect them, that the old certainties were dead. His fleets targeted agricultural worlds, creating artificial famines. They destroyed trade routes, triggering economic collapses. They broadcast executions of captured Jedi across the HoloNet, forcing billions to watch their heroes die. Every action was calculated not just for military advantage, but for psychological impact. And it worked. Panic spread through the Republic. Worlds that had paid their taxes and trusted in Coruscant's protection suddenly felt abandoned and vulnerable. Some planets tried to negotiate separate peace treaties with the Sith. Others hired mercenaries for protection, having lost faith in the Republic military. A few even welcomed the Sith, believing that any government was better than the chaos of war. Within a single year, the Sith controlled over 100 star systems. The Republic declared a state of emergency, finally mobilizing its military and granting the Supreme Chancellor wartime powers. The Jedi Order abandoned its temples on the frontier worlds and consolidated its forces. Training programs were hastily redesigned to focus on combat rather than meditation. But everyone understood the terrible truth. This wasn't going to be a quick war. This wasn't going to end with a single decisive battle. The Sith had returned with a vengeance that had been brewing for 3,000 years. And they weren't going to stop until either the Jedi were extinct or they themselves were destroyed. The galaxy held its breath and prepared for a war that nobody yet realized would consume the next 1,000 years. Peace, that beautiful illusion that had lasted so long, was dead, and in its place came only darkness, blood, and the screaming of the damned. 20 years into the war, a child was born on Coruscant who would live her entire life without ever knowing peace. She would grow up to the sound of distant explosions as Sith raids tested the planet's defenses. She would raise her own children in bomb shelters. She would die at 78, still hearing the thunder of warships overhead. 3 generations of her family would be born, live, and die knowing only conflict. This wasn't unusual. This was normal. This was what the galaxy had become. The war settled into a rhythm of horror. Advance, retreat, counterattack, stalemate, repeat endlessly across thousands of worlds. Battles that would have been considered apocalyptic catastrophes in the old days became routine. A planet changing hands. That happened weekly. Tens of thousands dead in a single engagement, barely worth mentioning in the news feeds anymore. The Republic military, hastily assembled and desperately undertrained at the war's beginning, evolved into something terrifyingly efficient. Conscription became universal. Every able-bodied citizen between 18 and 45 could expect to serve. Military academies that had once produced a few hundred officers per year now churned out thousands. Shipyards that had built pleasure cruisers and cargo haulers retooled for warship production. But it was the Jedi Order that underwent the most profound transformation. The philosophers and peacekeepers of the pre-war era were dying off, quite literally. In their place rose a new generation of Jedi who had never known the luxury of meditation and debate. These were warrior monks, their lightsaber forms honed not in training halls but in actual combat against enemies who genuinely wanted them dead. Form 3, Sorezu, became the dominant lightsaber style, almost by necessity. In an age where every battle involved deflecting dozens or hundreds of blaster bolts, the defensive perfection of Sorezu meant the difference between life and death. Jedi who had once scorned its passive philosophy now embraced it with religious fervor. Survival mattered more than elegance. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant transformed from a place of learning into what was essentially a military headquarters. Strategic planning rooms replaced meditation chambers. The sounds of lightsaber training echoed constantly through halls that had once been silent. Young Padawans, some as young as 12, were rushed through accelerated training programs because the Order needed bodies on the front lines. And they were dying. Oh, how they were dying. The Jedi Order lost 2,000 knights in the first century of the war. Masters who had trained for decades fell to Sith ambushes. Promising Padawans were cut down before they ever achieved knighthood. Every death diminished the Order's strength, but they couldn't afford to hold back. The Sith wouldn't allow them that luxury. Yet, for all the Republic's mobilization and adaptation, they couldn't gain a decisive advantage, because the Sith had their own problems that paradoxically made them even more dangerous. Darth Ruin's vision of Sith unity lasted exactly 18 years before fracturing in the most predictable way imaginable. A Sith Lord named Kara decided that Ruin's leadership was too cautious, too measured. He wanted more aggressive expansion, more conquered worlds, more power, so he did what Sith do. He challenged Ruin to single combat. Ruin killed Kara, but the damage was done. Other Sith Lords began questioning the alliance. Why should they share power with others when the dark side taught that strength came from domination? The old Sith ways, the ancient philosophy of one to embody power, one to crave it, started whispering in ambitious minds. In 1950, before the Battle of Yavin, 50 years after the war began, Darth Ruin was assassinated, not by the Jedi, but by a coalition of his own followers who had grown tired of his authority. The new Sith Empire fractured overnight into 5 major factions, each led by a powerful Sith Lord who claimed to be Ruin's rightful successor. The Jedi Council allowed themselves a moment of hope. Surely the Sith would destroy themselves now. Surely their inherent instability would lead to collapse. All the Republic had to do was wait and occasionally push back against whichever faction seemed strongest. They were catastrophically wrong. The fractured Sith factions proved more dangerous than the unified Empire had ever been. Each Lord now competed not just against the Republic but against each other, and the easiest way to prove your superiority: kill more Jedi, conquer more worlds, demonstrate greater ruthlessness. It became a twisted competition where the galaxy itself was the trophy and the body count was the score. A Sith Lord named Belia Darzu conquered 40 systems in a single year just to prove she was more capable than her rival, Lord Cordis. Another Lord, whose name was lost to history, developed a bioweapon specifically designed to target Jedi, killing through their Force connection. It failed, but the attempt itself showed how far the Sith were willing to go. The Republic tried to exploit these divisions, playing Sith factions against each other. Sometimes it worked. More often, it just meant 2 Sith armies would pause their mutual war long enough to crush the Republic forces that had tried to interfere, then resume killing each other. But the Sith infighting created another problem that nobody had anticipated. Dark Jedi. War does terrible things to people, even to those trained in the light side of the Force. Jedi who had spent decades learning compassion and mercy found themselves thrust into situations where kill or be killed became the only choice. They watched their friends die. They saw civilians massacred. They felt anger, hatred, fear, everything they'd been taught to resist. Some fell slowly, making small compromises that accumulated over years. A little too much aggression in combat, using fear to interrogate prisoners, executing defeated enemies, rather than accepting surrender. Others fell in a single moment of overwhelming rage or despair, but fall they did, in numbers that horrified the Jedi Council. By the end of the 1st century, over 300 Jedi had abandoned the Order. Some joined the Sith factions, others became independent warlords, carving out their own territories through Force-enhanced brutality. A few simply disappeared into the criminal underworld, using their powers for personal gain. The galaxy now faced not 2 sides in a war, but dozens Republic forces. 5 or 6 major Sith factions, countless minor dark side warlords, rogue Jedi, criminal empires filling the power vacuums, planetary governments that had declared independence from all of them. It was chaos on a scale that defied comprehension. And the civilians, they suffered beyond measure. Entire generations knew nothing but war. Children grew up in refugee camps, their parents dead or conscripted. Agricultural worlds were deliberately targeted, creating famines that killed billions. Trade routes that had existed for millennia were now too dangerous to use, causing economic collapse across sectors. Some worlds changed hands so many times that the population stopped caring who was in charge. Sith occupation, Republic liberation, another Sith conquest? It didn't matter anymore. Each new ruler demanded taxes, conscripted soldiers, and promised protection they rarely delivered. The only constant was suffering. The Battle of Mizra exemplified the war's brutality. A beautiful world of oceans and archipelagos, Mizra had managed to stay neutral for 60 years through careful diplomacy. When a Sith fleet finally arrived to claim it, the planetary governor refused to surrender. The Sith Lord commanding the fleet, enraged by this defiance, ordered an orbital bombardment so intense that it ignited the planet's atmosphere. The Mizra burned for 6 days. 400 million people died. When the fires finally consumed all available oxygen, what remained was a dead rock orbiting a star. Its oceans boiled away, its surface fused into glass. The Sith didn't even land troops. They had made their point. Stories like Mizra spread throughout the galaxy, each one a lesson in the futility of resistance and the price of defiance. Hope became a luxury few could afford. The galaxy learned to exist in a state of perpetual trauma, where the best you could hope for was that today's horror would be marginally less terrible than yesterday's. By the year 1900, before the Battle of Yavin, the first century of the new Sith Wars had concluded. The Jedi Order had lost 2,000 knights. The Republic controlled perhaps 60% of the galaxy it had once governed absolutely. The Sith factions controlled the rest when they weren't too busy fighting each other. And everyone understood with growing dread that this was only the beginning. The war had become self-sustaining, a fire that fed on its own destruction. Peace wasn't just distant, it was unimaginable. The galaxy had forgotten what it even meant. 750 years of war had turned the galaxy into something unrecognizable. Entire star systems existed as perpetual battlegrounds, their populations living in bunkers and caves, emerging only when absolutely necessary. The concept of childhood innocence had become historical curiosity. 3-year-olds could identify warship classifications by their engine sounds. The young learned to run before they learned to walk, because running meant survival. But it was the Sith who had degraded most dramatically. What had begun as Darth Ruin's coalition of 40 lords had splintered, reformed, and splintered again countless times over the centuries. By 1250, before the Battle of Yavin, there were dozens of self-proclaimed Sith Lords, each controlling a handful of systems, each convinced of their own superiority, each spending as much energy fighting other Sith as fighting the Republic. The dark side had become democratized in the worst possible way. Anyone with force sensitivity and enough ambition could find a Sith Lord willing to train them, usually because that Lord needed more warriors to throw at their enemies. Quality had given way to quantity. Traditional Sith teachings, which emphasized mastery and discipline, were abandoned in favor of churning out barely trained dark side users who knew just enough to be dangerous. The Jedi had managed to hold the line, but barely. Their numbers had stabilized around 8,000. But these were not the Jedi of old. These were scarred veterans, many missing limbs, all missing innocence. They had developed a grim pragmatism that would have horrified their predecessors. When faced with Sith forces too strong to defeat, they retreated. When offered the chance to kill a Sith Lord, they took it without hesitation. The philosophical debates about the nature of the Force had been replaced with tactical discussions about kill zones and defensive perimeters. Into this exhausted, grinding stalemate stepped a figure who would reshape the war's final chapter. His name was Catan, though whether that was his birth name or a title he claimed, history doesn't record. What is known is that he was unlike any Sith Lord who had come before. Khan was brilliant, not just powerful in the Force, though he certainly was that. Not just skilled in combat, though few could match his blade. Khan possessed something rare among the Sith, strategic vision combined with the charisma to make others share it. He could see patterns that others missed, understand weaknesses that remained invisible to conventional thinking. He looked at the fractured Sith factions and saw not diversity of strength but multiplication of weakness. Every Sith Lord fighting for supremacy was a resource wasted. Every dark side warrior killed in Sith versus Sith combat was one less blade to use against the Jedi. The Republic didn't need to defeat the Sith were defeating themselves. Khan's solution was radical to the point of heresy. He proposed abandoning the most fundamental principle of Sith philosophy, the hierarchy, the pyramid of power with one supreme lord at the apex and everyone else scrambling for position. Instead, he envisioned something unprecedented, a brotherhood of equals. The Brotherhood of Darkness, as he named it, would be a coalition of Sith Lords who recognized each other as peers. No supreme leader, no constant backstabbing and assassination. Decisions would be made collectively, power would be shared, at least until the Jedi and Republic were destroyed. After that, well, they could sort out the details of who ruled what. It was insane. It went against everything the Sith believed. The dark side taught that strength came from domination, that equality was weakness, that only through conflict did the worthy rise. Khan's proposal should have been laughed out of existence. But Khan was persuasive. He approached each Sith Lord individually, tailoring his pitch to their specific desires and fears. To the ambitious, he promised the combined resources of multiple Sith factions, making conquest easier. To the paranoid, he offered protection from rivals. To the ideological, he painted a vision of the Jedi Order's complete annihilation, something no single Sith faction could achieve alone. And he demonstrated the concept's effectiveness through action. Kane united 3 minor Sith factions under his Brotherhood banner and launched a coordinated assault on the Jedi stronghold of Ruusan. It was a minor victory, but it proved his point. United Sith forces had accomplished in days what divided factions had failed to do in decades. Over the next 50 years, Khan worked tirelessly to expand his Brotherhood. Some Sith Lords joined willingly, convinced by his arguments. Others required more aggressive persuasion. When a particularly stubborn Lord refused to join, Khan would orchestrate situations where that Lord found himself fighting Republic and rival Sith forces simultaneously, then offer Brotherhood membership as salvation. And the Lords who refused? The ones who saw Khan's Brotherhood as betrayal of Sith principles, they were destroyed. Not by Khan alone, but by the combined might of all Brotherhood members. It sent a clear message: join us or face annihilation. There was no third option. By 1100 before the Battle of Yavin, the Brotherhood of Darkness controlled 80% of all Sith territory. 23 major Sith Lords had sworn allegiance to the Brotherhood's principles. More importantly, they had pooled their resources in ways the Sith had never managed before. Sith academies were standardized. Instead of each Lord training warriors in their own preferred methods, the Brotherhood established systematic training programs. The most important of these was on Korriban, the ancient Sith homeworld. There, thousands of Force-sensitive recruits were transformed into dark side warriors through brutal, efficient indoctrination. Were they true Sith Lords? By traditional standards, no. Most were what earlier generations would have dismissed as dark side adepts or fallen Jedi, lacking the deep mastery of Sith philosophy and technique. But they could wield a lightsaber. They could channel Force lightning, they could kill Jedi, and in a war of attrition, that was enough. The Brotherhood's fleet became the largest concentration of military might the galaxy had seen. Dozens of Sith Lords contributing their ships created an armada that could darken the skies of entire sectors. Coordinated strikes replaced random raiding. Strategic planning replaced improvised attacks. The Republic realized, with growing horror, that they were no longer fighting a disorganized collection of Sith warlords. They were fighting an empire. The Jedi Council's response came in the form of Lord Hoth, a name that would echo through history alongside Khan's. Hoth was 60 years old, gray-haired and scarred from 4 decades of warfare. He had been fighting Sith since he was 20, had seen friends die, had watched the Order struggle and adapt and survive. If anyone understood what needed to be done, it was Hoth. He proposed his own radical solution. The Army of Light, a dedicated Jedi military force that would match the Brotherhood's consolidation of power. Instead of Jedi being scattered across 1,000 different battlefronts, they would unite under single command. They would train together, fight together, and bring the full weight of the light side to bear against the darkness. The Jedi Council hesitated. This went against centuries of tradition. The Jedi were supposed to be independent, following the Force's guidance individually. Centralized military command felt too much like the martial orders that had failed in ages past. But Hoth was persuasive, and more importantly, he was right. The old ways weren't working. The Army of Light assembled on Ruusan, a strategically located world in the Mid-Rim. Over 100 Jedi Knights answered Hoth's call, along with 50,000 Republic soldiers who volunteered for what everyone knew would be the most dangerous assignment of the war. They established forward bases, fortified positions, and prepared for what Hoth promised would be the final confrontation. Because Hoth understood something that the Jedi Council didn't want to admit. This war would never end through gradual attrition. It would only end when one side achieved total victory over the other. Half measures and defensive strategies would just prolong the suffering. Someone needed to force a decisive battle, winner take all. Khan recognized the same truth. When his spies reported the Army of Light's formation on Ruusan, he didn't see a threat. He saw an opportunity. The Jedi were finally concentrating their forces, finally abandoning their scattered defensive posture, finally willing to fight the kind of battle the Sith had been trying to provoke for centuries. Both leaders began moving their pieces into position. Hoth called for every available Jedi reinforcement. Katan summoned the full strength of the Brotherhood. Supply lines were established. Orbital defenses were fortified. Strategies were debated and refined. The galaxy watched with a mixture of hope and dread. Everyone understood that something unprecedented was about to happen. The 2 largest concentrations of Force users in galactic history were converging on a single world. The light side and dark side would clash with an intensity never before witnessed. Ruusan, an unremarkable world of forests and valleys, was about to become the most important battlefield in history. And what would happen there would reshape the galaxy for the next 1,000 years, though not in any way that either Hoth or Khan could have imagined. The storm was gathering, and when it finally broke, the screaming would be heard across the stars. Ruusan wasn't chosen for its strategic importance by accident. This world sat at the crossroads of 4 major hyperspace routes, making it a natural choke point between the Outer Rim territories and the more densely populated Inner Rim. Control Ruusan, and you controlled access to hundreds of systems. Lose it, and you'd be fighting a defensive war on multiple fronts simultaneously. The planet itself was beautiful in that tragic way that doomed places often are. Endless forests of old-growth trees, their canopies so thick that walking beneath them felt like entering a cathedral. Rolling valleys where morning mist gathered in pools of white. Rivers that ran clear and cold, teeming with life that had never known the touch of industrial civilization. The native population was small, perhaps 50,000, living in scattered agricultural communities that had existed peacefully for generations. They evacuated within days of Lord Hoth's arrival. The Jedi helped them board transport ships, promising they could return when the fighting ended. Most never would. Many died in refugee camps on other worlds, their immune systems unable to cope with unfamiliar diseases. Those who survived would eventually settle elsewhere, Ruusan becoming nothing more than a painful memory of a home that no longer existed. The Army of Light fortified the Valley of the Jedi, a natural basin surrounded by cliffs and accessible only through 3 narrow passes. Hoth chose this location deliberately. The terrain negated the Brotherhood's numerical advantage. Funnel an army through narrow passages, and numbers become a liability rather than an asset. The valley became a fortress, its approaches mined and trapped, its heights bristling with artillery positions. For 3 months, Hoth drilled his forces relentlessly. Jedi, who had spent decades fighting independently, had to learn coordinated tactics. Battle meditation circles were practiced until every member could feel the other's presence in the Force without conscious thought. Republic soldiers trained alongside Jedi, learning to fight in mixed units where a warrior with a lightsaber covered a squad with blasters, and vice versa. Hoth himself was everywhere, inspecting defenses, reviewing plans, speaking with soldiers and Jedi alike. Those who served under him reported that he had a gift for making each person feel seen, valued, essential to the coming battle. He remembered names, he asked about families, he shared meals with common soldiers. It was leadership through genuine connection, and it forged the Army of Light into something more than a military force. It became a brotherhood in its own right, bound by mutual respect and shared purpose. When the Brotherhood of Darkness finally arrived in orbit above Ruusan in 1006, before the Battle of Yavin, they came with overwhelming force. Over 200 warships emerged from hyperspace, their combined mass creating gravitational distortions that registered on sensors across 3 star systems. Lord Cadden commanded from his flagship, surrounded by 20 Sith Lords who had sworn to see this battle through to whatever end awaited. The orbital bombardment began immediately. Not the genocidal assault that had destroyed worlds like Mizra, but targeted strikes designed to soften defensive positions without rendering the planet uninhabitable. The Sith needed Ruusan intact. This wasn't about destruction, this was about dominance. For 3 days, the valley trembled under the hammer of orbital fire. Trees that had stood for centuries disintegrated in plasma blasts. Rock faces melted and reformed into glassy slag. The Jedi maintained defensive shields when possible, but mostly they endured, huddled in reinforced bunkers while the world above them burned. Then the dropships came, thousands of them, blackening the sky like a swarm of metal locusts. They landed in waves, disgorging 40,000 Sith warriors and dark-side adepts onto Ruusan's scarred surface. The ground assault had begun, and with it, the first true test of whether Hoth's strategy could withstand Cannon's might. The initial clashes were chaotic, brutal affairs. Sith forces pushed through the mountain passes, only to find themselves caught in kill zones where concentrated fire from above tore through their ranks. Dark side warriors who tried to scale the valley walls met Jedi strike teams who had positioned themselves specifically for such attempts. Bodies fell and kept falling, tumbling down cliff faces to pile at the bottom like cordwood. But the Sith kept coming. For every warrior who fell, 2 more took their place. Kant had brought enough forces to absorb horrific casualties and still maintain offensive pressure. It was attrition warfare in its purest form, a mathematics of death, where the side with more bodies to throw into the grinder would eventually overwhelm the other. On the 4th day of ground combat, Karning himself led a charge through the Eastern Pass. 20 Sith Lords surrounded him, their combined presence in the Force like a black sun that burned with malevolent power. They carved through defensive positions with terrifying efficiency, their lightsabers leaving trails of red light that lingered in the air like wounds in reality itself. Lord Hoth met them in the pass. Behind him stood 30 Jedi Knights, the most powerful warriors the Order could field. The two forces collided with an impact that those watching from distance claimed they could feel in their bones. Lightsaber met lightsaber in a symphony of screaming energy. The Force itself seemed to scream as light and dark clashed in ways that defied physical description. Hoth and Khan faced each other in the center of the maelstrom. Both were masters of their respective philosophies. Both had spent lifetimes honing their skills. Both knew that killing the other would shatter enemy morale and possibly end the battle immediately. They fought with the desperate intensity of men who understood that this moment mattered more than any other in their long, violent lives. Neither could overcome the other. Toth's defensive mastery matched Kanan's aggressive innovation. Every attack was countered. Every opening was denied. They fought for hours, their duel becoming a fixed point around which the larger battle swirled. Eventually, exhaustion forced them apart. Kain retreated to his lines. Hoth stumbled back to the valley, supported by his knights. The pass was littered with dead from both sides, but it remained in Republic hands. The first battle of Ruusan ended after 37 days of continuous combat. Casualty counts were horrific. The Army of Light lost 5,000 soldiers and 12 Jedi Knights. The Brotherhood lost 15,000 warriors and 3 Sith Lords, their bodies abandoned in the passes where they fell. By any measure, it should have been a decisive Republic victory. They held the valley. They'd inflicted disproportionate casualties. They'd proven that concentrated Jedi forces could stand against the Brotherhood's might. But Kain didn't withdraw. He established siege positions and called for reinforcements. This was no longer about taking Ruusan quickly. This had become personal. The Brotherhood had been humiliated, and Kain's authority within it depended on turning defeat into victory. He would take the valley or die trying. 2 years passed. 2 years of skirmishes, raids, and preparations. Both sides received reinforcements and resupply. The Army of Light swelled to 70,000 soldiers and 120 Jedi. The Brotherhood grew to over 100,000 warriors and 25 Sith Lords. Ruusan became the center of the galactic war, drawing forces from across known space like gravity, pulling matter into a black hole. The Second Battle of Ruusan began in 1004, before the Battle of Yavin, with something new. Catan had consulted with Sith sorcerers and learned techniques that earlier generations of Sith Lords had considered too dangerous or unpredictable. Battle meditation, but twisted through the dark side into something weaponized and terrible. As the Brotherhood's forces advanced, 15 Sith Lords linked their minds in a meditation circle behind the front lines. They reached out through the Force, not to coordinate their own troops, but to assault the minds of their enemies. Waves of despair rolled across the battlefield. Republic soldiers suddenly felt crushing hopelessness. Why fight? Why resist? Death was inevitable. Surrender was mercy. Some soldiers broke and ran. Others froze in place, paralyzed by existential dread. A few turned their weapons on themselves, choosing quick death over the psychological torture. The Brotherhood advanced through this wave of manufactured terror, cutting down demoralized enemies with ease. The Jedi felt it too, but they had been trained for this. Lord Hoth immediately organized counter-meditation circles. 50 Jedi Knights formed 5 interconnected groups, pouring light side energy into the battlefield. Peace, hope, purpose. They pushed back against the dark tide, creating pockets of clarity where Republic soldiers could remember why they fought. For 10 days, 2 spiritual forces clashed on a plane beyond physical sight. Soldiers reported seeing visions in the sky, massive entities of light and shadow wrestling for dominance. Some claimed they saw the faces of dead comrades in the clouds, urging them to hold the line. Others swore they heard voices promising rest if they would just lay down their arms. The psychological battlefield was as brutal as the physical one. 3 Jedi Masters died during the meditation, their hearts simply stopping as they poured too much of themselves into the Force. 7 Sith Lords collapsed from exhaustion, several never recovering their full strength, and through it all the mundane horror of conventional warfare continued. Blasters fired, lightsabers clashed, people died in numbers that defied comprehension. The second battle ended in another stalemate, both sides too exhausted to continue. But something had changed. Everyone involved understood that this wasn't going to be resolved through conventional means. The war had escalated into metaphysical dimensions, where victory would require weapons and tactics that pushed the boundaries of what the Force itself could endure. 5 more battles would follow over the next 2 years, each more desperate than the last, each leaving more dead in the Cursed Valley, and each bringing the final terrible confrontation one step closer. His birth name was Dassel, and he came from the kind of poverty that grinds souls into dust. Born on Apatros, a miserable mining world where the air tasted of chemicals and life expectancy rarely exceeded 40, he learned brutality before he learned to read. His father was a drunk and a bully who took out his failures on a son who couldn't fight back. At least, not until the day Dassel killed him. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even fully conscious. His father had been beating him, as usual, when something inside Dassel snapped. Rage flooded through him, with an intensity that felt almost physical. His father flew backward across the room, hit the wall hard enough to crack ribs, and never got up. Dassel stared at his hands, not understanding what had happened, but knowing instinctively that he had to run. He joined the Republic military under a false name, seeking anonymity in the vast machine of a wartime army. For a while, it worked. He was a good soldier, disciplined and effective, but the rage never fully left him. It simmered beneath his surface, occasionally erupting in ways that frightened his fellow troopers. When he got caught running an illegal fighting ring, using that strange power he didn't understand to dominate opponents, his military career ended abruptly. That's when the Sith found him. A recruiter who recognized Force sensitivity when he saw it, offered Dassel a choice: return to meaningless existence on some backwater world, or come to Korriban and learn to harness the power that already flowed through him. The choice was obvious. At the Sith Academy, on Korriban, Dassel chose a new name, Bad Bane. Simple, direct, evocative of destruction. He threw himself into training with the obsessive focus of someone who had never been given a real chance at greatness before. While other students socialized and formed alliances, Bane studied ancient texts, Sith holocrons, historical records of every major Sith Lord who had ever lived. And he began to see patterns. The Sith always failed, not despite their power, but because of how they wielded it. Every Sith empire eventually collapsed from internal conflict. Every coalition of Dark Lords eventually turned on itself. The Brotherhood of Darkness, for all its initial success, was already showing cracks. Ambitious lords questioned Kane's leadership. Rivalries festered. Resources were wasted on internal power struggles rather than fighting the Jedi. Bane's genius was recognizing the fundamental flaw. The dark side of the Force was inherently individualistic. It rewarded personal power, individual ambition, the triumph of the strong over the weak. Trying to create a brotherhood of equals went against the very nature of what the dark side taught. You couldn't share darkness. You could only embody it, alone and absolute. He found ancient texts that spoke of the rule of two, a philosophy so old that even most Sith had forgotten it. One master to embody the power, one apprentice to crave it. When the apprentice surpassed the master, they would kill them and take an apprentice of their own. This ensured constant evolution, constant refinement, Each generation of Sith would be stronger than the last because only the truly exceptional survived. The other students at the academy thought Bane was insane. They mocked his ideas openly. Even the instructors dismissed him as a talented but misguided zealot. But Bane didn't care about their opinions. He cared about being right. And he knew, with the certainty that comes from true understanding, that he was. When the Academy finally sent him to Ruusan to join the Brotherhood's forces, Bane went not as a loyal soldier, but as an observer. He watched the battles with analytical detachment, noting every tactical error, every wasted opportunity, every moment where Sith pride got in the way of Sith effectiveness. And he saw Lord Kayan, once brilliant and visionary, deteriorating under the stress of command. Kayan was losing his mind. The prolonged battle meditation sessions had damaged something fundamental in his psyche. He saw betrayal everywhere, even among loyal followers. He had become paranoid, erratic, occasionally incoherent. The other Sith Lords noticed but were too afraid to act. Challenging a mad lord was still challenging a lord, and the risk of failure meant death. Bane approached Kanan carefully, playing the role of concerned subordinate rather than ambitious rival. He suggested, gently at first, that the Jedi were somehow stronger than they appeared, that conventional tactics wouldn't work, that perhaps the Brotherhood needed to consider more extreme measures. And when Kane's paranoia latched onto these suggestions, Bane fed them carefully, like a gardener tending poisonous plants. The thought bomb was ancient Sith sorcery, so dangerous that even the most ruthless Dark Lords had banned its use. It required multiple Sith working in perfect synchronization to create a massive force weapon that would annihilate every force-sensitive being within its blast radius. Not kill them physically, but rip their souls from their bodies and trap them in an eternal void of screaming agony. The bodies would remain unmarked and whole, but the spirits would be gone, suffering forever in a prison beyond death. Bane researched the ritual exhaustively. He knew exactly what it would do. He also knew that the Sith who created it would be caught in its effect along with their Jedi enemies. It was a weapon of mutual destruction, useful only if you were willing to die alongside your enemies, or if you were smart enough to not be present when it detonated. He brought the idea to Kaisi during the 6th Battle of Ruusan, when the fighting had reached a fever pitch and casualties on both sides were catastrophic. He framed it as a weapon of victory, a way to destroy the Army of Light completely, and finally, and he lied. He told Kaisi that with proper preparation and the right meditation techniques, the Sith Lords who created the bomb could shield themselves from its effect. They would survive while every Jedi died. Kayan, desperate and half-mad, believed him. Or perhaps some part of Kayan knew it was a lie, but didn't care anymore. The war had consumed him so completely that death might have seemed like mercy. Either way, he began making preparations. The 7th and final battle of Ruusan began in 1000. Before the Battle of Yavin, both sides threw everything they had left into the conflict. The Army of Light, reduced to 40 Jedi and barely 10,000 soldiers, held their positions with the grim determination of those who know they're fighting their last battle. The Brotherhood, still numbering in the tens of thousands, pressed forward with the momentum of forces that could smell victory. For 5 days, the fighting never stopped. There was no day or night in the valley anymore, just an eternal twilight of blaster fire and lightsaber glow. Bodies piled so high in some areas that troops had to climb over their own dead to advance. The ground became mud, but the mud was red, and everyone understood what it was made from. Lord Hoth knew the end was coming. The Jedi had fought brilliantly, had held far longer than anyone thought possible, but they were simply too outnumbered. Within days, perhaps hours, the Brotherhood would overwhelm the last defensive positions. He sent a message to the Jedi Council on Coruscant, a final report that was equal parts tactical assessment and eulogy. He asked if they should retreat, save what remained of the Army of Light for future battles. The Council, safe on Coruscant, advised withdrawal, but Hoth refused. If they ran, the Brotherhood would chase them across the galaxy. The war would continue, and everything they'd suffered at Ruusan would be meaningless. Better to make a stand here. Better to buy time for the rest of the Order, even if the price was total sacrifice. Meanwhile, in the caves beneath the valley, Kain gathered the remaining Sith Lords of the Brotherhood. 15 of them answered his call, the survivors of battles that had killed dozens of their peers. He explained the thought bomb to them, described how it would destroy every Jedi in the valley. Some protested. Lord Kopeds, who had always been more thoughtful than most Sith, recognized the ritual for what it really was, a suicide weapon. Kain killed him with Force lightning for his doubt. The display of sudden violence cowed the remaining lords into submission. If you opposed the thought bomb, you died immediately. If you participated, you might survive, or at least you'd take the Jedi with you. The choice, such as it was, seemed clear. Darth Bane watched all of this from a safe distance. He had volunteered to coordinate the ritual's outer defenses, a role that required him to be several kilometers away from where the bomb would detonate. The other Sith accepted this eagerly. Nobody wanted to be in the caves when the ritual began. Bane's willingness to take a dangerous position seemed like loyalty. It was actually survival instinct refined to perfection. On the surface, Lord Hoth sensed the massive dark side energy building beneath the valley. Every Jedi felt it. A pressure in the Force like reality itself was being compressed into a singularity. They didn't understand what was happening, but they knew it was catastrophic. Hoth called all remaining Jedi to him and formed them into a meditation circle. If they couldn't stop what was coming, they would at least try to shield as many Republic soldiers as possible. The 40 Jedi Knights stood together in the center of the valley, their minds linked through the Force, creating a barrier of light against the darkness rising from below. Around them 10,000 soldiers watched in confusion, unable to perceive the spiritual battle taking place but sensing something terrible approaching. In the caves, Kain and 14 Sith Lords began the ritual. Their voices rose in ancient scythes, words that hurt to hear, syllables that seemed to bend space around them. Dark side energy spiraled inward, compressing, intensifying, becoming something that was no longer quite part of the physical universe. The air in the cave grew thick and purple. Reality started to crack. Vane reached his ship and launched into orbit just as the thought bomb completed its formation. From space, he watched as a sphere of purple-black energy erupted from the caves and expanded across the valley in seconds. It moved through physical matter as if it didn't exist, passing through rock and soil and bodies without resistance. When it touched the Jedi's defensive circle, there was a moment of resistance. 40 minds united in the light side of the Force, pushing back against annihilation with everything they had. For a heartbeat, it seemed like they might actually hold. Then the bomb overwhelmed them and kept expanding. Every Force-sensitive being within 10 kilometers died instantly. 40 Jedi collapsed where they stood. 15 Sith Lords disintegrated in the caves. Hundreds of minor Force-sensitives scattered across the battlefield dropped dead. The Republic soldiers not sensitive to the Force survived the bomb's effect, but watched in horror as their Jedi generals simply fell, their eyes still open, their bodies unmarked, their spirits torn away to a place beyond death. The valley fell silent. After 2 years and 7 battles, after tens of thousands dead, after the valley's beauty had been transformed into a landscape of ash and blood, it was finally over. The Brotherhood of Darkness had destroyed itself. The Army of Light had been annihilated. And Darth Bane, orbiting above in his ship, smiled. His plan had worked perfectly. The weak Sith were dead. The Jedi were crippled. And he was free to rebuild the Sith the right way. His way, the The rule of two would begin today, and in 1,000 years his successors would finally destroy the Jedi Order completely. The new Sith Wars had ended, but the story of the Sith was far from over. The news from Ruusan reached Coruscant through channels of silence. Communication arrays went dead. Supply ships reported finding the valley covered in bodies. Republic soldiers who survived the thought bomb were evacuated in states of shock so profound that many never spoke coherently again. They had watched their Jedi commanders die for no visible reason, had felt something fundamental tear in the fabric of reality, and their minds simply couldn't process what they'd witnessed. When the full reports finally reached the Senate, they read like fever dreams. The entire Army of Light destroyed, Lord Hoth dead, 40 Jedi Knights gone in an instant, but also, impossibly, the Brotherhood of Darkness annihilated. Every Sith Lord who had been at Ruusan was confirmed dead. The coordinated Sith armies were collapsing without leadership, surrendering or fleeing in disarray across dozens of systems. The galaxy didn't know how to react. Celebration seemed wrong when the cost had been so astronomical. But relief was undeniable. After 1,000 years, the war was finally over. Children would grow up without air raid sirens. Families wouldn't be torn apart by conscription. Agricultural worlds could plant crops without fear that orbital bombardment would turn their fields to ash before harvest. On Coruscant, spontaneous gatherings formed in the streets. People wept openly, though whether from joy or grief or exhaustion nobody could say. The Senate held a moment of silence that stretched for nearly an hour, as representatives from across the galaxy simply sat, unable to find words adequate to the moment. The Supreme Chancellor resigned that day, stating that he was a wartime leader and the galaxy needed someone who understood peace. The Jedi Temple became a house of mourning. The Order had lost 40 of its finest warriors at Ruusan, but the true casualty count was far higher. Over 7,000 Jedi had died during the millennium of conflict. The temple's memorial halls, designed to honor fallen Jedi with individual plaques, simply ran out of space. They had to create new wings, vast chambers where thousands of names were etched into walls that stretched towards ceilings lost in shadow. The surviving Jedi struggled with a crisis of purpose and identity. For generations, the Order had been defined by war. Young Padawans had been trained primarily for combat. Meditation and philosophy had become secondary to tactical doctrine and battle coordination. Now suddenly they were expected to return to being peacekeepers and diplomats. But how do you meditate when your dreams are full of screaming? How do you counsel peace when violence is all you've known? The Ruusan Reformation emerged from this crisis, a comprehensive re-evaluation of everything the Jedi Order stood for and how it operated. The reforms were radical, painful, and necessary. Jedi would never again command Republic armies. They would serve as advisors, mediators, and when absolutely necessary, as individual defenders of justice. But the age of Jedi generals leading soldiers into battle was over. Aggressive lightsaber forms like Juyo were discouraged, almost banned. The study of ancient Sith holocrons was restricted to senior masters only, and even then under strict supervision. Attachment remained forbidden because the war had proven how easily love could be twisted into hate, how quickly compassion could become cruelty when those you cared for were threatened. Some Jedi disagreed with these reforms. They argued that the Order's warrior traditions had kept them alive, that abandoning combat readiness was foolish. Several dozen Jedi left the Order peacefully during this period, unwilling to embrace what they saw as a retreat into weakness. History would prove both sides partially right. The Jedi's return to peaceful ways allowed them to rebuild and heal, but it also made them vulnerable when the Sith returned a millennium later. The Republic military underwent its own transformation. The massive conscript armies were demobilized over a 2-year period. Millions of soldiers returned to civilian life. many struggling to adapt. They had spent their entire adult lives in military structure, and the freedom of peacetime felt more like abandonment. Veteran support systems were established, though they were woefully inadequate for the scale of need. War crimes tribunals were considered, then quietly abandoned. Too many atrocities had been committed on both sides. The Republic had done terrible things in the name of survival. Orbital bombardments of Sith-held worlds, summary executions of prisoners, the use of chemical weapons in particularly desperate battles. Trying to sort out justice from such comprehensive horror seemed impossible, so instead, the galaxy chose collective amnesia. The hunt for surviving Sith became an obsession for Republic intelligence services. Brotherhood armies, leaderless and scattered, were systematically destroyed over a 2-year campaign. Dark Jedi who had operated independently during the war's chaos were tracked down and either killed or captured. Sith academies were bombed from orbit. Korriban itself, the ancient Sith homeworld, was subjected to such intensive bombardment that its surface became partially molten. By 998, before the Battle of Yavin, the Republic declared with absolute confidence that the Sith were extinct. Every known dark side user had been accounted for. Every Sith stronghold had been destroyed. The threat that had nearly ended civilization was finally completely eliminated. They even held a ceremony celebrating the end of the Sith, where the Supreme Chancellor symbolically shattered a red lightsaber. They were, of course, completely wrong. Darth Bane was alive and hidden, and he wasn't hiding alone. On Ruusan, in the aftermath of the thought bomb, Bane had discovered a young girl named Zana. She was 10 years old, had witnessed horrors that would break most adults, and possessed raw force sensitivity that Bane recognized immediately. She had survived the thought bomb's detonation through sheer chance, being just outside its effective radius. The trauma had left her mind fractured but malleable. Bane took her as his apprentice, the first student of what would become the Rule of Two. He taught her everything he had learned, refined through his understanding of where the Brotherhood had failed, power through secrecy, patience over immediate gratification, quality over quantity, one master, one apprentice, always. They disappeared into the galaxy's forgotten corners, while the Republic celebrated victory. Bane trained Zana for 20 years, until she was strong enough, skilled enough, worthy enough to challenge him. When she finally killed him in ritual combat, exactly as he had planned, the Rule of Two proved itself. The apprentice had surpassed the master. The Sith line would continue, stronger with each generation. The galaxy at large knew nothing of this. As far as everyone was concerned, the Sith were history. Ancient bogeymen that children learned about in school, but never expected to encounter in reality. The Republic reduced its military to a fraction of its wartime size. The Jedi returned to their temples and focused on rebuilding their numbers and their purpose. Trade routes reopened. Commerce resumed. Slowly, painfully, normalcy returned. But normalcy for a post-war galaxy was different from the peace that had existed before. An entire generation had been traumatized. 3 generations, actually, all of whom had known only conflict. They struggled with peacetime in ways that shocked the younger people who had been born near the war's end. Mental health crises swept across refugee populations. Substance abuse skyrocketed among veterans. Suicide rates among former soldiers remained elevated for 50 years. Cultural production reflected the trauma. Art became darker, more cynical. Literature focused on survival and loss rather than hope and adventure. Music took on minor keys and haunting melodies. Philosophers debated whether sentient beings were fundamentally destructive, whether civilization itself was sustainable, whether the Force was truly balanced or inherently chaotic. Economic recovery took longer than anyone expected. The war economy had been so total, so consuming, that converting it back to civilian production proved nightmarishly complex. Shipyards that had built warships for centuries had to be retooled for cargo vessels and passenger liners. Weapon manufacturers closed or pivoted to producing tools and machinery. Unemployment spiked as military industries downsized. Some worlds never recovered. Planets that had been agricultural breadbaskets before the war, but had been repeatedly conquered, found their soil poisoned by chemical weapons. Terraforming efforts failed more often than they succeeded. These worlds became monuments to the war's cost, dead rocks orbiting their suns, permanent reminders of what had been lost. By 900, before the Battle of Yavin, a full century after Ruusan, the galaxy had finally achieved something resembling stability. The generation that had fought in the war was mostly dead. Their children, the first peace generation, had built new lives that weren't defined by conflict. Trade flourished. Art flourished. The Jedi Order stabilized at around 8,000 members, smaller than before, but healthier, more focused. And in the shadows, the Sith line continued. Bine to Zana, Zana to Cognos, Cognos to Millennial. Each generation learning from the previous, growing stronger, more patient, more cunning. They watched the galaxy forget them, and they smiled, because when you're forgotten you can prepare without interference. And they had 1,000 years to prepare for revenge. Numbers become abstract at a certain scale. When historians estimate that between 1 and 3 trillion sentient beings died during the new Sith Wars, the mind simply rejects the figure as incomprehensible. 3 trillion is not a number we're equipped to feel. It's a statistical abstraction too large to carry emotional weight. So let me try a different approach. Imagine a world, not Coruscant or any famous planet, but an average agricultural world in the mid-rim, population around 5 million, peaceful, productive, ordinary. During the 1,000 years of war, this world changed hands 14 times. Each conquest meant executions of the previous government, conscription of able-bodied adults, seizure of food supplies for military use. By the time the war ended, the population had been reduced to 300,000, 4.7 million people dead from violence, starvation, disease, or simply fleeing and dying somewhere else as refugees. Now multiply that world by 10,000, because there were at least that many worlds caught in the war's grinding teeth. Some suffered worse. Many suffered just as badly. A few, through geographic luck or strategic unimportance, suffered less. But the pattern repeated across the galaxy with mechanical inevitability. The Zabrak species nearly went extinct. Their homeworld of Iridonia was conquered and reconquered so many times that reliable population counts became impossible. Pre-war estimates suggested 20 billion Zabrak across their various colony worlds. By the war's end, perhaps 2 billion remained. An entire species reduced to 1/10 its population, and with them went languages, cultural traditions, artistic movements, and genetic diversity that can never be recovered. The Cathar suffered similarly. Their warrior culture made them prized recruits for both Republic and Sith forces. The Cathar answered the call to arms enthusiastically, seeing it as their duty. By the war's end, their species was classified as endangered. Whole bloodlines had been extinguished. Their homeworld's population had collapsed so severely that it took 5 centuries to recover even half of what had been lost. 43 worlds were rendered completely uninhabitable during the conflict, not temporarily damaged or requiring extensive terraforming, but dead. Atmospheres burned away. Surfaces turned to radioactive glass. Biospheres so thoroughly destroyed that even bacterial life couldn't survive. These worlds still exist, orbiting their stars like tombstones, visible reminders of what weapons designed by Force users could accomplish when restraint was abandoned. Mizra became the symbol for this category of destruction. Once a water world of stunning beauty, it had been home to 400 million people whose civilization was built on artificial archipelagos that floated on planet-spanning oceans. When the Sith orbital bombardment ignited its atmosphere, the resulting firestorm burned for 6 days. The oceans boiled away. The floating cities melted into the superheated water before evaporating into steam. When the fires finally exhausted their fuel, Mizra was a desert world where molten rock pools glowed beneath a thin, toxic atmosphere. But planetary destruction, as horrific as it was, represented only the most visible cost. The infrastructure damage was almost as devastating and far more difficult to rebuild. The Holit, the galaxy's communication backbone, lost 40% of its relay stations to battle damage, sabotage, or simple neglect. When maintenance became impossible in war zones, it took 2 full centuries to restore the network to pre-war capacity. Educational institutions were systematically targeted by both sides. The Sith destroyed universities to eliminate future Republic leaders and thinkers. The Republic bombed Sith academies to prevent training of dark side users. In the crossfire, thousands of years of accumulated knowledge vanished. Libraries burned, research archives were looted or destroyed. Entire fields of scientific inquiry were set back centuries because the specialists who understood them were dead and their research materials were ash. The economic devastation was equally comprehensive. Galactic GDP, the total productive output of all civilized worlds, dropped by 70% over the course of the war. Trade routes that had existed for millennia became too dangerous to use. Merchant shipping was seized by both militaries or destroyed by raiders taking advantage of the chaos. Currency collapsed repeatedly as governments fell, and new regimes tried to establish monetary systems. The Hutt cartel, already powerful before the war, became arguably the most stable institution in the galaxy during the conflict. Their criminal empire filled the vacuum left by failing legitimate governments. By the war's end, the Hutt controlled more territory through economic influence than many official governments. They achieved this not through military conquest, but by being the only organization capable of guaranteeing trade and basic services in regions where official authority had collapsed. Environmental damage scarred thousands of worlds in ways that persisted for centuries. Chemical weapons poisoned groundwater. Biological weapons designed to target specific species occasionally mutated and caused ecological cascades. The sheer volume of ship debris in orbit around contested worlds created hazardous debris fields that made space travel dangerous and prevented reconstruction efforts. Some worlds spent decades just clearing their orbital space before they could rebuild planetary infrastructure. Climate change affected over 500 worlds where orbital bombardments or ground fighting damaged enough infrastructure to disrupt atmospheric regulation systems. Formerly temperate planets became ice balls or deserts. Agricultural worlds could no longer support the crops they'd grown for millennia. Populations either adapted, migrated, or died. Usually they died. The psychological damage was impossible to quantify, but perhaps the most lasting. An entire civilization developed what we might call collective PTSD. Trust in institutions evaporated. Faith in the future became naive optimism that practical people mocked. Cynicism and nihilism flourished in art, philosophy, and daily life. The pre-war belief in progress and improvement was replaced by a grim survivalism that assumed disaster was always just around the corner. This manifested in unexpected ways. Birth rates plummeted across the galaxy. Why bring children into a universe that seemed designed to consume them? Marriage became less common. Long-term planning seemed foolish when tomorrow might bring conquest by a new warlord. Entire cultures developed fatalistic philosophies centered on accepting suffering as the natural state of existence. The Jedi Order's spiritual crisis reflected the galaxy's broader trauma. They had tried to be warriors and peacekeepers simultaneously, and had failed at both. 7,000 Jedi dead over a millennium might not sound like much compared to trillions of civilian casualties, but it represented over 40% of the Order's total strength at the war's beginning. And these weren't random deaths. These were the Order's best and brightest, the masters and knights who understood both combat and philosophy, leadership and humility. The survivors were haunted. They had seen things that the peaceful Jedi philosophy had never prepared them for. They had made compromises that seemed necessary at the time, but felt like betrayals in hindsight. Some had killed prisoners. Some had used the Force in anger. Some had stood by while Republic forces committed atrocities because stopping them would weaken the war effort. These weren't theoretical, ethical dilemmas anymore. They were memories that wouldn't fade. Ruusan itself became a wound in the Force that never healed. The Valley of the Jedi, where the thought bomb had detonated, remained haunted by the souls it had trapped. Force-sensitive beings who approached the planet reported hearing screams, feeling overwhelming despair, sensing the presence of thousands of spirits unable to pass into whatever lay beyond death. The planet was declared forbidden. Nobody was allowed to settle there. Nobody wanted to. The true cost of the new Sith Wars wasn't just measured in bodies or destroyed worlds or collapsed economies. It was measured in hope. Abandoned, innocence lost, and the fundamental transformation of galactic civilization from optimistic and expansive to traumatized and defensive. The galaxy that emerged from the war was darker, harder, and infinitely more cynical than the one that had entered it. And perhaps most tragic of all, the lessons learned from this 1,000 years of horror would be forgotten by the time the Clone Wars began. The galaxy would repeat its mistakes, because that's what traumatized civilizations do. They try so hard to forget their pain that they forget the warnings that pain was meant to teach. History remembers leaders, but it rarely captures who they truly were. The figures who shaped the new Sith Wars were not the archetypal heroes and villains that later generations would imagine. They were complex, flawed beings who made choices that seemed reasonable at the time and catastrophic in hindsight. Understanding them as people rather than symbols reveals something important about how civilizations fall into darkness. Lord Kyan began as an idealist, which might surprise those who only know him as the mad architect of the thought bomb. In his youth, before falling to the dark side, he had genuinely believed that conflict arose from misunderstanding and that unity could overcome any obstacle. When he turned to the Sith philosophy, he didn't abandon this belief. He simply redirected it toward unifying the Sith rather than bringing peace to the galaxy. For decades, his vision worked. The Brotherhood of Darkness represented the most successful Sith coalition in history precisely because Kyan understood that dark side users needed structure to channel their ambitions productively. But the stress of leadership, the constant need to balance egos and ambitions, the weight of thousands dying under his command gradually eroded his sanity. By Ruusan, he had become a shadow of himself. Paranoid, cruel, desperate. The thought bomb wasn't a calculated strategy. It was the decision of a broken man who couldn't see any other way forward. His death was fitting in its irony. Cassian had spent his life trying to unite the Sith, and in the end, his greatest achievement was their complete annihilation. The weapon he believed would bring victory instead destroyed everything he had built. If some fragment of his consciousness survived in the thought bomb's prison, trapped with the Jedi he hated and the Sith Lords who had followed him, then his fate was perhaps the cruelest of all. Lord Hoth represents the other side of that tragic coin. Where Khan fell from idealism to madness, Hoth transformed from peaceful Jedi to battle-hardened general without ever losing his essential decency. He never wanted to be a warrior. Circumstances forced that role upon him, and he accepted it with grim determination rather than enthusiasm. Those who served under Hoth spoke of his compassion, even in the midst of horror. He remembered the names of soldiers under his command. He wept for the Jedi who died in his battles. He never became numb to death, which was both his greatest strength and his deepest wound. Every casualty damaged him personally. By the time he made his final stand at Ruusan, He was 65 years old but looked 80. The war had consumed him from the inside out. His choice to remain at Ruusan, knowing it meant certain death, was entirely in character. Hoth had never asked others to take risks he wouldn't accept himself. When the Jedi Council advised retreat, he knew they were tactically correct. But tactics weren't the point anymore. If the Jedi abandoned Ruusan, what did they stand for? What separated them from the Sith? If they ran when the cost became too high? Hoth died believing that sacrifice had meaning, and perhaps in the long arc of history, he was right. The Jedi Order survived because leaders like him were willing to pay the ultimate price. Darth Bane stands apart from everyone else in this story because he won, not immediately, and not in ways that anyone at the time recognized, but his victory was total and lasting. He identified the fundamental flaw in Sith philosophy and corrected it with ruthless logic. His rule of two survived for a millennium, and ultimately achieved what the Brotherhood of Darkness never could: the complete destruction of the Jedi Order. But Bane's victory came at the cost of becoming something inhuman. He abandoned every connection, every weakness, every trace of the person he had been. Dusel, the frightened boy from Apatros, died long before Darth Bane's physical body did. What remained was pure purpose, distilled ambition without sentiment or doubt. When Zana finally killed him in ritual combat, he died satisfied, not because he wanted to die, but because his death proved the rule of two functioned as designed. The apprentice had surpassed the master. The Sith line would continue stronger than before. Darth Zana herself deserves recognition as more than just Bane's successor. She was 10 years old when she witnessed the thought bomb's detonation, young enough that the trauma rewired her developing brain in fundamental ways. Bane shaped her into the perfect Sith apprentice, but she brought her own innovations to the tradition. Her specialization in Sith sorcery and mental manipulation added dimensions to the dark side arsenal that Bane had never fully explored. She lived to be 90 years old, which was almost unheard of for Sith Lords. Most died violently long before old age could claim them. Zana's longevity suggests she understood something crucial about balancing ambition with patience. She trained her own apprentice, Darth Cognis, and when the time came, she allowed herself to be killed without bitterness. The rule of two had become more important than her individual survival. That acceptance of mortality in service to a larger goal marked a profound evolution in Sith thinking. General Leia Grayson represents the forgotten majority in this conflict. The ordinary people, not gifted with Force sensitivity, who nevertheless bore the war's weight. She commanded Republic forces at Ruusan, coordinating the movements of 50,000 soldiers across 7 battles. She watched the Jedi she served with collapse dead from the thought bomb's effect, their bodies unmarked but their spirits torn away to places she couldn't follow. She survived the war physically intact but psychologically shattered. The last 10 years of her life were spent in psychiatric care, unable to escape the memories of what she'd witnessed. Her fate was shared by millions of veterans who returned from the front with wounds that no medical technology could heal. Their suffering was deemed less important than the dramatic Force battles between Jedi and Sith, but their pain was no less real. Lord Kopetz deserves mention as the Sith who saw clearly and died for it. He was a warrior poet, one of the few dark side users who combined physical prowess with genuine intellectual depth. His writings on Sith philosophy, recovered centuries later, show a mind grappling with contradictions in ways most Sith never attempted. He questioned the Brotherhood's structure. He recognized the thought bomb for what it was, a suicide weapon born of desperation rather than strategy. Kain killed him for speaking truth to power, which became a lesson in itself. Even among supposed brothers, dissent was intolerable. Kaise's death proved that the Brotherhood's unity was always an illusion, held together by force rather than genuine shared purpose. His last words, according to witnesses, were simply, "This is madness." History would prove him correct. Master Valentine Farfalla survived Ruusan because he was in orbit coordinating supply lines. When the thought bomb detonated, he felt thousands of deaths simultaneously through the Force, a psychic tsunami that nearly killed him from shock alone. When he recovered, he dedicated his remaining years to ensuring the Jedi Order never forgot the lessons of the new Sith Wars. Farfalla was instrumental in crafting the Ruusan Reformation, the comprehensive overhaul of Jedi doctrine and practice. He insisted on preserving the brutal truth of what had happened, even when others wanted to sanitize history for public consumption. His detailed records, sealed in the Jedi archives, contained honest assessments of Jedi failures, Republic atrocities, and the moral compromises that combat had forced upon the Order. He trained the next generation of Jedi with a gentleness that surprised those who knew his reputation as a warrior. Students reported that he never raised his voice, never showed anger, but possessed an intensity of focus that was somehow more intimidating than rage. He died at 110 years old, having seen the Order stabilize and begin healing. His last recorded words were "Remember Ruusan, always remember." Darth Githany adds a note of personal tragedy to the grand historical sweep. She was a Jedi who fell not from ideology, but from seduction. The dark side offered her power, and she wanted it with an intensity that overwhelmed her training. Her relationship with Darth Bane before Ruusan showed that even Sith were capable of connection, though theirs was twisted by ambition and betrayal. When she sensed Bane's plan to destroy the Brotherhood, she tried to betray him first. He responded by poisoning her with a Sith toxin that caused her body to decay from the inside out. She died slowly, painfully, before the thought bomb ever detonated. Her last moments were reportedly filled with regret, though whether she regretted falling to the dark side or merely getting caught is unclear. Either interpretation reveals something truthful about the nature of the dark side's appeal and its ultimate cost. These individuals, and thousands more like them, shaped a millennium of conflict through choices both profound and mundane. They were not monsters or saints, but people confronting impossible situations with flawed understanding and limited options. Their legacy persists not because they were exceptional, but because the patterns they established, the mistakes they made, and the prices they paid would echo through galactic history for the next 1,000 years. The new Sith Wars should have taught the galaxy lessons that would prevent future catastrophes. Should have. But civilizations are remarkably skilled at learning exactly the wrong things from trauma, and the post-war Republic proved no exception to this pattern. The most obvious lesson was that numerical superiority means nothing without strategic coherence. The Brotherhood of Darkness fielded armies 10 times larger than the Jedi could muster, yet they couldn't achieve decisive victory because their forces pulled in different directions. Individual Sith Lords pursued personal glory rather than coordinated objectives. Resources were wasted on internal power struggles. The dark side's emphasis on individual strength became a strategic liability when facing an enemy that actually worked together. Darth Bane learned this lesson perfectly. His rule of two eliminated the possibility of Sith civil wars by limiting the Sith to 2 individuals at any given time. No armies to coordinate, no competing egos to manage, just master and apprentice, working toward a single goal across generations. It was brilliant in its simplicity and proved devastatingly effective when Palpatine finally enacted the grand plan a millennium later. The Republic, meanwhile, learned the opposite lesson. They concluded that massive standing armies were unnecessary luxuries that led to militarism and oppression. By 1,000 years after Ruusan, the Republic military had been reduced to a ceremonial force barely capable of handling pirates. When the Clone Wars erupted, they had to create an army from scratch because they'd forgotten that peace requires the capacity to defend it. The new Sith Wars taught them that war was terrible, but they mistook that truth for meaning war was avoidable. The Jedi Order's crisis of identity produced the Ruusan Reformation, which established principles that lasted until the Clone Wars destroyed them. Jedi would be peacekeepers, not soldiers. They would advise governments, not command them. They would emphasize diplomacy and meditation over combat training. These were reasonable responses to the trauma of becoming warrior monks who spent a millennium killing. But the pendulum swung too far. By the time of the Phantom Menace, Jedi were so committed to peaceful resolution that they'd become tactically incompetent. When Qui-Gon Jinn encountered Darth Maul, he was facing a threat the Order had convinced itself didn't exist. The Jedi's insistence that the Sith were extinct for a millennium wasn't just historical fact, it was psychological necessity. They needed to believe the darkness was defeated, because confronting its potential return was too traumatic. The irony is almost painful. The Jedi reformed themselves based on lessons from fighting the Sith, but those reforms made them vulnerable to the Sith's return. Bane's successors studied the new Sith Wars extensively and specifically designed their strategies to exploit Jedi weaknesses created by the Ruusan Reformation. Palpatine didn't conquer the galaxy, despite the lessons of history. He conquered it because he understood those lessons better than anyone else. On a tactical level, the new Sith Wars revolutionized lightsaber combat. Form 3, Sorisu emerged directly from the need to deflect sustained blaster fire from multiple directions. Before the war, lightsaber dueling emphasized elegant one-on-one combat between Force users. During the war, Jedi found themselves surrounded by dozens of enemies with ranged weapons. Survival required perfect defense, which Sorisu provided. Form Vor Xian and DJEMSO also developed during this period, offering aggressive alternatives that used defensive techniques as springboards for counterattacks. Form Vor Ji Niman, often dismissed as the diplomat's form, was actually synthesized from lessons learned about adapting to unpredictable combat scenarios. Every major lightsaber form used in the prequel era, except Form Vor Jia, owed its refinement to new Sith Wars innovations. The war's environmental devastation sparked the first serious galactic conservation movements. Organizations dedicated to preserving ecosystems and preventing planetary-scale destruction emerged in the war's aftermath. These groups lacked political power, but represented an important shift in consciousness. Sentient beings started recognizing that their actions had consequences that lasted beyond immediate concerns. Economically, the post-war period saw the rise of institutions that would dominate galactic commerce for the next millennium. The banking clan, trade federation, and commerce guild all consolidated power during the Reconstruction era. They provided financial services and trade coordination that government institutions were too damaged to offer. By the time of the Clone Wars, these organizations had become so powerful they could credibly threaten the Republic itself. This represented a lesson learned but misapplied. The galaxy recognized that economic stability mattered for preventing conflict. What they failed to understand was that concentrating economic power in unaccountable organizations created different vulnerabilities. Palpatine exploited these corporate entities masterfully, using their influence to create the separatist crisis that justified his emergency powers. Cultural legacy proved more diffuse but equally important. Art produced in the new Sith Wars era or immediately after carried themes of loss, sacrifice, and questioning previously accepted truths. The philosophical movement known as meaning in suffering emerged from war trauma, arguing that finding purpose in pain was the only way to process overwhelming grief. This philosophy influenced Jedi thinking for centuries, though critics argued it romanticized trauma rather than healing from it. Literature from the period included epic poetry cycles that attempted to capture the war's scope. These works, thousands of pages long, chronicled specific battles, honored specific heroes, and tried to give meaning to incomprehensible loss. Modern scholars debate whether these texts helped process trauma or simply reinforced it through constant remembrance. Both interpretations probably contain truth. The phenomenon of collective amnesia deserves examination. Within a few centuries of Rusin, the new Sith Wars had been reduced to a historical footnote in popular consciousness. Schools taught that the Sith existed once and were defeated, but the brutal details were omitted. The 1,000 years of grinding warfare, the trillions dead, the civilizational collapse, all of it was compressed into a single paragraph in history texts. This wasn't accidental. The Republican Jedi Order actively suppressed detailed accounts, arguing they were too disturbing for public consumption. Master Pernika's comprehensive history of the war was sealed in the Jedi archives and deemed accessible only to senior masters. The rationale was preventing glorification of violence. The effect was ensuring future generations didn't understand what large-scale Force user conflict actually looked like. When Darth Maul appeared on Naboo, the Jedi Council's initial response was denial bordering on delusion. They couldn't accept what the evidence showed, because accepting it meant confronting suppressed trauma. Qui-Gon Jinn's insistence that he'd fought a Sith Lord was met with skepticism, not because the Council thought he was lying, but because they psychologically couldn't process the implications. The rule of two's success vindicated Bane's analysis in ways that should terrify anyone studying this history. A philosophy based on patience, secrecy, and generational planning defeated an order of 10,000 Jedi who thought they'd learned the right lessons from the new Sith Wars. The Jedi prepared to fight the last war, which meant they were fundamentally unprepared for the actual threat. Palpatine studied everything that destroyed the Brotherhood of Darkness, and did the opposite. He maintained absolute secrecy. He avoided large Sith armies that would attract attention. He infiltrated existing power structures rather than opposing them directly. He let the Republic destroy itself through internal contradictions rather than attacking it militarily. Every strategic choice he made reflected deep understanding of why previous Sith attempts at galactic domination had failed. The greatest lesson of the new Sith Wars might be that trauma-based learning is inherently flawed. Organizations and civilizations that define themselves in opposition to past horrors inevitably create new vulnerabilities. The Jedi became so afraid of being warriors that they forgot how to defend themselves. The Republic became so committed to peace that it allowed tyranny to grow unchecked. The galaxy learned to fear the Sith's military might, but never anticipated their political cunning. Perhaps the real tragedy is that these lessons were available. Master Pernika wrote them down. Jedi historians studied them. Military strategists analyzed them. The knowledge existed. What was lacking was the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of conflict, power, and the eternal struggle between light and darkness. The galaxy chose comfortable lies over difficult truths, and that choice made Palpatine's victory inevitable. The new Sith Wars taught everything necessary to prevent the Clone Wars and the rise of the Empire. Every lesson was there, written in blood across 1,000 years of suffering. The galaxy simply refused to learn them. When Qui-Gon Jinn stands before the Jedi Council in The Phantom Menace and reports encountering a Sith Lord, Mace Windu responds with a line that carries far more weight than most viewers realize. Impossible. The Sith have been extinct for a millennium. That millennium begins precisely at Rusin. The thought bomb detonated in 1000 before the Battle of Yavin. The events of The Phantom Menace occur in 32 before the Battle of Yavin. Exactly 968 years separate them. The Jedi Council's confident dismissal of the Sith threat wasn't arrogance. It was trauma response. They genuinely believed the Sith were gone because they needed to believe it. Accepting that the Sith might have survived meant accepting that the sacrifices of Rusin, the deaths of Lord Hoth and the Army of Light, the 1,000 years of rebuilding, might all have been for nothing. The psychological weight of that possibility was simply too much to bear. But Darth Maul's appearance shattered that comfortable delusion. In a single engagement, He proved that everything the Jedi thought they knew about the post-Ruusan galaxy was wrong. The Sith hadn't been destroyed. They'd been hiding. And if they'd been hiding successfully for a millennium, what else had they been doing in that time? The answer was Darth Bane's lineage. From Bane to Xana to Cognos to Millennial to Vectivus to Plagueis to Sidious. Each generation spent decades learning everything their master knew, then adding their own innovations before passing the accumulated knowledge to the next apprentice. By the time Darth Plagueis took Palpatine as his student, the Sith possessed 1,000 years of refined dark side mastery, political manipulation tactics, and strategic planning. Plagueis specifically studied the new Sith Wars when training Sidious. He made his apprentice read detailed accounts of how the Brotherhood of Darkness had failed. They analyzed Khan's mistakes. They studied why Jedi battle meditation had been effective. They identified every weakness the Sith had displayed and developed countermeasures. The grand plan that Palpatine ultimately executed was built on lessons learned from the new Sith Wars. The Clone Wars themselves represent a dark echo of the new Sith Wars pattern. Once again, Jedi became generals leading clone armies. Once again, the Republic mobilized for total war. Once again, combat transformed the Jedi Order from peacekeepers into warriors. And once again, a Sith manipulator orchestrated the conflict from behind the scenes for purposes the Jedi didn't understand until too late. But there was a crucial difference. During the new Sith Wars, the Jedi fought openly acknowledged enemies. The Brotherhood of Darkness wasn't hiding. They controlled territories, commanded armies, and opposed the Republic directly. The Jedi could see their enemy and respond accordingly. During the Clone Wars, the enemy was invisible. Palpatine controlled both sides of the conflict, ensuring that no matter who won individual battles, the Sith agenda advanced. The Ruusan Reformation's prohibition against Jedi commanding armies was violated within hours of the Clone Wars beginning. The Jedi Council justified this by claiming emergency circumstances, exactly as they'd done 1,000 years earlier. They promised themselves this was temporary, that they'd return to their principles once the crisis passed. They never got the chance. Order 66 executed while they were still playing the role of generals, which meant they were scattered across the galaxy commanding clone troops programmed to kill them. If the Jedi had maintained the Ruusan Reformation's principles, would Order 66 have succeeded? If Jedi had remained concentrated on Coruscant and other temple worlds, rather than dispersed across battlefields, would the clone troopers have been able to eliminate them so efficiently? These questions haunt the what-ifs of galactic history. Yoda survived Order 66 and lived long enough to train Luke Skywalker. By then he was 900 years old, which meant he was born approximately 100 years after Ruusan. The lessons of the new Sith Wars were living memory during his youth. He would have been trained by Jedi, who had been trained by survivors of the conflict. Yet even Yoda didn't recognize what Palpatine was doing until it was too late. His exile on Dagobah, where he spent 20 years reflecting on the Jedi Order's failures, probably brought him back to the new Sith Wars repeatedly. The Order had made the same mistakes twice. They'd become warriors when they should have been guardians. They'd involved themselves in politics when they should have maintained independence. They'd trusted institutions rather than trusting the Force. Every principle established at Ruusan had been violated, and the result was the Order's near extinction. When Yoda trains Luke in The Empire Strikes Back, his methods reflect hard-learned lessons from both the new Sith Wars and the Clone Wars. He emphasizes patience over action, wisdom over strength, understanding the Force rather than merely wielding it. He's trying to create a Jedi who won't make the mistakes his Order made twice, though whether he succeeded remains debatable given Luke's repeated rushes into danger. The Valley of the Jedi on Ruusan appears in expanded universe material, specifically the Dark Forces video game series. Kyle Katarn, a Jedi in the New Republic era, visits the valley and encounters the trapped spirits of the Jedi and Sith who died in the thought bomb. A dark side user named Jarek attempts to tap into the valley's power, believing it will make him invincible. The storyline suggests that even 1,000 years later, the thought bomb's effect persisted. Souls remained trapped, unable to pass into the Force or find peace. Katarn ultimately defeats Jarek, and through a combination of light side meditation and help from the trapped Jedi spirits, manages to finally release them. If this story is taken as canonical to the legend's continuity, it means the victims of Ruusan suffered for over a millennium before finding rest. The thematic resonance of the new Sith Wars illuminates the entire Star Wars saga in ways casual viewers might miss. This isn't just backstory. It's the foundation that explains why the Jedi of the prequel era behaved as they did, why they were vulnerable to Palpatine's manipulation, and why the rule of two succeeded where massive Sith empires had failed. George Lucas never depicted the new Sith Wars in film, but their influence permeates his work. The prequel trilogy's themes of institutional decline, forgotten history repeating itself, and democracy dying to thunderous applause, all connect to patterns established during the new Sith Wars. The Old Republic era, frequently referenced but rarely detailed, contains this millennium of darkness that shaped everything which came after. For viewers trying to understand how Palpatine could orchestrate such an elaborate scheme over decades, studying the new Sith Wars provides answers. He had the advantage of 1,000 years of Sith knowledge accumulated specifically to exploit Jedi weaknesses. He understood their trauma responses because his predecessors had documented them exhaustively. He knew exactly which buttons to push because Darth Vader had identified those buttons when watching the Jedi at Ruusan. The prophecy of the Chosen One, which motivates so much of the prequel trilogy's plot, gains additional meaning against the new Sith Wars background. The Jedi believed Anakin would destroy the Sith and bring balance to the Force, but the Sith had already survived extinction once after Ruusan. What made the Jedi so confident they could actually eliminate the dark side permanently? The answer is that they weren't confident at all. They were desperate. The Jedi of the prequel era sensed darkness growing, but couldn't identify its source. They felt the Force becoming clouded, but didn't understand why. A prophecy about a Chosen One, who would definitively end the Sith, offered hope in a situation where they felt increasingly powerless. They wanted to believe so badly that they ignored warning signs about Anakin, because acknowledging those warnings meant losing hope. In the end, the prophecy did come true, just not in the way anyone expected. Anakin became Vader, served Palpatine, then killed him to save Luke. The Sith were destroyed, but it required Anakin to fall to darkness, spend decades as an agent of evil, and sacrifice himself in the process. Balance came at horrific cost, which feels entirely consistent with the new Sith Wars pattern, where victory always demands more than anyone wants to pay. So what does all this mean for us, the audience consuming these stories across different media and eras? The new Sith Wars teach us that history's lessons are only valuable if we're willing to learn them, that institutions create their own blind spots, that preparing to fight the last war guarantees defeat in the next one, that trauma, if not properly processed, becomes a strategic vulnerability enemies will exploit. The Jedi Order fell twice, a millennium apart, because they never truly healed from the first fall. They built their entire identity around avoiding the mistakes of the new Sith Wars, which made them vulnerable to different mistakes in the Clone Wars. They were so afraid of becoming warriors that they forgot how to defend themselves, so committed to peace that they couldn't recognize tyranny growing in their midst. And perhaps most importantly, the new Sith Wars demonstrate that the conflict between light and darkness is never truly resolved. It evolves. The Sith were defeated at Ruusan but returned stronger through adaptation. The Jedi rebuilt after Order 66 but remained vulnerable to darkness in new forms. The cycle continues because the Force itself contains both aspects, and balance doesn't mean elimination of one side. It means acceptance of eternal struggle. When you watch Star Wars now, knowing what came before, every scene carries additional weight. Qui-Gon's confidence that he fought a Sith becomes more poignant when you understand what Sith return would mean. Yoda's warnings to Luke gain depth when you realize he's speaking from centuries of accumulated failure. Palpatine's success becomes more impressive when you understand he accomplished what Kain and every previous Sith Lord couldn't. The new Sith Wars remain the most brutal era in Star Wars history, precisely because they're the most forgotten. Trillions died. Civilizations collapsed. The galaxy was fundamentally transformed, and within a few centuries it was all reduced to a single line in history texts. The Sith were extinct for a millennium. Such a simple statement containing such unimaginable horror. But now you know. You understand what that millennium of extinction cost, and why it ultimately failed. You've walked through the Valley of the Jedi beside Lord Hoth and watched him choose sacrifice over survival. You've seen Darth Bane orchestrate the Brotherhood's destruction while planting seeds for their return. You've witnessed 1,000 years of war compress into a single moment of annihilation at Ruusan. This is the story they tried to forget. The era that shaped everything which followed, the brutal, grinding horror that the galaxy endured and then desperately tried to move past without fully processing. The new Sith Wars were the wound that never healed, the trauma that kept echoing through generations, the lesson that everyone knew but nobody truly learned. And in the end, that might be the most important truth of all. History doesn't end. Patterns don't break. The struggle between light and darkness continues in new forms, with new participants making the same fundamental mistakes their predecessors made, until someone finally learns to break the cycle rather than just survive it. The new Sith Wars ended at Ruusan 1,000 years before the movies began. But in every meaningful way they never ended at all. They just changed form and continued, as they always will, as long as sentient beings reach for power and the Force flows through the galaxy.